We're still on the Sea of Galilee. The storms. What kind of storms? Yeah, that's another story.
Jericho.
There is some weather forecast as far as Jericho is concerned. 2 storm events are recorded in the Gospels. The first is when Jesus takes his disciples to the harbor of Gadara. It's on the southeastern part of the Sea of Galilee. That's Matthew 8 and Mark 4. And the second storm is after the feeding of the 5,000. It's on the northern shore of the Sea of Galilee. That's in Matthew 14 and Mark 6. And when you think of a storm, our natural inclination is to think of, rain, dark skies, thunder and lightning. It's not surprising if we visualize the Lord calming that kind of storm, much like we might see on the news today. It's been told that way from flannel graph in childhood classes all the way through to movies and TV and that's just the kind of storm that you think of. The question is that the storm that you think of? It is represented in Rembrandt's painting, Christ in the storm on the Sea of Galilee. You seen that picture? If you've seen it, you've seen a copy of it because the original was stolen in 1990. We don't know where it is. In 1633, the famous Dutch master Rembrandt van Rijn painted the masterpiece. It's his only seascape picture. It was in the Isabella Gardner Museum in Boston, but it was stolen in March of 1990. You look at the picture, and I'm not much with art. My daughter, her senior class went on a field trip to the Chicago Art Museum, and I volunteered as a chaperone. You ever been there? Took me an hour to go through the whole thing. They had all day. I had seen every picture in there in 1 hour. I just walked by. Okay, yeah, like that one, don't like that one. Read the little thing, listened to it on my headset. An hour, I was done. I had to sit for about 5 or 6 more hours while they went through and studied them all. But anyway, I sat and looked at this picture for a long time. I don't know that I gained any insight. But I did learn a little bit. He has the panic-stricken disciples in their fishing boat. They're trying to regain control of the vessel. It's caught in the sudden storm. And I did catch 2 things. Number 1, started counting. There are 14 people in that boat. Who are they? Jesus, his disciples, who's the 14th? That's 13. Well, I didn't know this about Rembrandt, but he often paints himself in his pictures. So that's why there's 14 people in the boat. He never says it's him, but he always paints himself. And I did notice, you can't see it very well, right here, there's a guy hanging over, throwing up. I assumed that's the way he painted Judas, but I don't know. That was just my guess. That could be Rembrandt. But Judas was not a Galilean, so he wouldn't be used to the sea, I think. Could be, I don't know.
That would be me.
Yeah. Well, in Israel, let's just get a basic idea of the weather patterns to start with. In Israel, there are 2 seasons. What are they? Hot and hotter, okay, that's one way to put it. What else?
Rainy and dry.
Rainy and dry, yes. The wet season and the dry season. The wet season begins a few weeks after Sukkot. You know what that is, right? Sukkot? Sukkot. It is the Feast of Tabernacles. So the wet season begins just a few weeks after that. The rains have a special name in this season, Yoreh, or Yoreh. Y-O-R-E-H is the English spelling of the Hebrew word. These are early rains. Deuteronomy 11, Jeremiah 5, Psalm 84 all use this particular word, and other places. Generally, this is rain that falls between October and November. The early rain loosens the hard soil so that plowing can begin. The farmer can sow the seeds for the new agricultural year. Then comes the winter rains, and the winter rains can be these first ones, or there's a special name for the later rains. They're from December to February. It just depends on if it's a light rain or a heavy rain. If it's a light rain, they use that first word. If it's a heavy rain, like a big storm, they use the second word, which is malkosh. Song of Solomon, chapter 2. Psalm 18. 2 Samuel 23. Thunderstorms, rain, sometimes even snow in the higher elevations. That's these later rains, these hard rains. And they can go March even into April. Very heavy showers, we would call them. And the dry season begins after Shavuot. Shavuot, pronounced different ways. That's the Feast of Pentecost. Okay, that's May to October. Now, it isn't completely dry because there is dew in the mornings, and it can be a very heavy dew. In the early hours before sunrise, Genesis 27, Hosea 6, Hosea 13, Zechariah 8, all reference this heavy dew. But once the sun comes up, it dissipates very quickly. It generally is very, very dry, even with the dew. There are wildfires in the forest, in the brush. Isaiah 5, Isaiah 19, Joel 2, all reference the wildfires. That's the general picture. You have the wet season where it's very rainy, like once a week. At least you're going to get a heavy, heavy rain during the rainy season. During the dry season, you get very little rain at all, but a heavy dew in the mornings. So that brings us to the storms on the Sea of Galilee. I don't know if you can see this picture. If you can, you have the Sea of Galilee there. You can pick it out in the picture with land all around it. You've got updrafts from the sea that rise up into the atmosphere. And then, of course, the Mediterranean Sea out to the off to the side there, blowing in some strong winds. And when those mix, you can get some pretty good strong storms. 2 storm events recorded in the Gospels on the Sea of Galilee were both winter storms. Those storms come from the east off the Golan Heights. They're not like the rainstorms that come from the west or down from the north. Those are rainstorms. Due to the nature of how rainstorms develop, you can see them. Fishermen can spot them early. So these probably are not rainstorms, unless it's supernatural, which is always a possibility. And then they would, no matter how good they are, if it's supernatural, they're probably not going to pick it out, right? So we're not going to stand, solidly on this is not a rainstorm, but that's the direction it's sort of leaning. The eastern winter wind storms, on the other hand, come off the Golan Heights. They appear very suddenly with absolutely no preface. All of a sudden, you just have gale force winds. Very fierce winds. And that explains why the veteran fishermen were so terrified on the storms, because they do happen, and they do happen occasionally. They develop quickly, they develop fiercely, and they are life-threatening if you find yourself out in the middle of the sea or the lake when these storms pop up. So let's look at the first one. The first winter windstorm, we think, recorded in the Gospels, takes place about November of AD 28. That's my guess. If AD 30 is the crucifixion, the resurrection, and Jesus had approximately a 4-year earthly ministry, I'm going to pick AD 28. And this is a pivotal moment in Jesus' ministry. He has just been rejected by religious establishment. Let's go to Mark chapter 3. Let's read Mark's account since we're studying Mark on Sunday mornings. Mark chapter 3. At verse 22, we've just covered it. This is where they are saying he has not from God, but he is from Beelzebub. He is demon-possessed. And Jesus takes great offense and speaks of an unforgivable or unforgiven sin, which we talked about on Sunday morning. This blasphemy of the Holy Spirit, attributing good as bad and bad as good, if you will. We won't go back into that in its depths. Go over to Matthew 12. Hold a finger at both places. Just so that you can kind of get a feel, it's the same story. Matthew 12, beginning with verse 22. Same short, very brief parables that Jesus uses as his argument that Satan can't stand against Satan. I mean, that doesn't make any sense. Okay, all of this has just happened. So they get in a boat. They're on their way to Gadara. They're in a very small fishing vessel. They encounter a windstorm. Now, if you're in Mark, let's go to chapter 4. But we're at the end of the chapter. Okay, because he's been teaching. It's the parable of the sower at the beginning. It's the lamp under the basket, the seed growing, the mustard seed. He's been teaching, okay? We're at verse 35. On that day, when evening had come, he said to them, "Let us go across to the other side." Remember we talked about this earlier? Let's just go to another political region. Let's get away from here. Verse 36. Leaving the crowd, they took him with them in the boat, just as he was. I can't help but think they were singing "Just as I Am" as they travel across. What are other translations there? Leaving the crowd, they took him in the boat just as he was. Verse 36, is it not in there? Same thing? As he was. What does that mean?
Still the same clothes. Tired.
Still same clothes. I think we're to read into that too. He's just tired. He hasn't eaten. He's just worn out. And he goes just like that. He just gets in the boat and goes. And other boats were with him. Verse 36. Verse 37, and a great windstorm arose. Notice how the translations now are saying windstorm. What are some of the, if you have an older translation, what does it say?
Furious squall.
A furious squall. They're trying to get more technologically accurate. The newer translations. A great windstorm arose, and the waves were breaking into the boat, so that the boat was already filling. It describes those windstorms perfectly. Notice he doesn't mention any rain or thunder and lightning or anything else. Still bright daylight. It's just these heavy, heavy winds have kicked up. Verse 38, but he was in the stern, asleep on a cushion. They woke him. And they said to him, Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing? And he awoke and rebuked the wind, not the rain. He rebuked the wind and said to the sea, Peace, be still. And the wind ceased, and there was a great calm. And he said to them, Why are you so afraid? Have you still no faith? And they were filled with great fear and said to one another, Who then is this, that even the wind and the sea obeyed him? Well, they're in this squall. They're in this windstorm, and the waves have been so sloshed around that they're pretty deep, and they're coming up over the sides of the boat, and the disciples are, what emotion? Give an emotion to them. Scared? Terrified? You ever had nightmares about dying? Two that I really don't want to die like or from. One is drowning, and the other is by fire. If the Lord gives me, choices, I'm not picking either one of those two. These are fishermen. These are men's men. Remember we talked about this last week, the strength, the courage, the work that it takes. And they're out here on the lake, and this storm kicks up, and they are terrified. And where's Jesus? Asleep in the stern of the boat. What a striking contrast. I think we're supposed to see that. Why is Jesus asleep?
Number one, he's tired. Number two, he's not afraid.
Yeah. Number one, he's tired. He's been teaching. And probably for a while, we were having a discussion, I think it was recently, I can't remember who with, maybe you're in here if it was with you, but public speaking. I read a study, this has been years ago, but public speaking can take the same amount of calcium out of your bones, 30 minutes of public speaking, as an entire football game to a football player. It drains your strength. If you don't believe me, get up there and try it sometime. Sometimes Karina will ask, why are you so tired on Sunday afternoon? I'm not, my muscles aren't tired, I'm just bone tired. It takes it out of you, it drains you. So he's tired. He's asleep. And he is not afraid. Why isn't he afraid? Well, one is the obvious. He's asleep, may not know what's happening. He has no reason to fear. He's Jesus. He was the creator of it all.
You also throw in the fact that he knows this is not the end.
He knows it's not his time. So the disciples wake him up, and what's their question? Don't you care? Lord, don't you care? What a question. See, they're just afraid. When you're afraid, are you thinking logically? The answer is no. You're not. When you're afraid, you don't think logically. I have to tell this story because I know some of my family will be watching, and I don't tell this story very often. But when we lived in Walker County, our next door neighbor is Big John. Big John has a big watermelon patch, and there's some other vegetable It's a big, huge garden in between our farm and his. And I have to walk across that, but it's at night. We've had supper at Big John's house. It's a school night. My mom asked me to take my brother home. My brother's 10 years younger than me. So I'm probably a freshman in high school. Is that 13 or so?
13, 14.
Yeah, so he is 3 or 4. Now, across the street, okay, there's a big field here, Big John's house, our house, but across the street is another farmer that has cows, and he has a mean bull. We knew to stay away. I have my brother on my shoulders because it's just easier, and I'm walking across the vegetation, which, you know, dips, rows. Okay, it's not easy. It's not an easy trek. I hear the bull. At least what I thought was the bull. And we went from a walk to a trot to a flat-out run. Now, logic would tell you don't run in a garden when you can't see, because this is not going to have a good outcome. But I was afraid. And logic was telling me the bull's loose. It's running after me. You better get out of Dodge. So guess what we did? We fell face first into something. I'm glad it was just dirt. But he and I both fell face first into the dirt. And that's what's wrong with the poor guy. But I picked him up and we just kept on running. You know, wiped off when we got home. And I tried to get him in bed asleep before my parents got home so I wouldn't get in trouble. When you're afraid, you don't think logically. They're not thinking logically. Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing? And then what happens? He asks why they're afraid. What does he say? He asked if they had any faith. Look at verse 38. He's in the stern. He's asleep. They wake him up. Teacher, do you not care we're perishing? He awoke and rebuked the wind and the sea. And what did he say?
Quiet,
Peace. Be still. And he does ask, why are you so fearful? But he says, quiet, peace, be still. And what do you suppose happened? Instantly, don't you think? I don't think it took, a half hour to settle down. I think in an instant, the wind stopped. The waves stopped. I mean, this was absolute. They were certain this was a miracle. It wasn't that all of a sudden the storm just blew itself out. Everything stopped. And everything, just a lake that was rip-roaring and here and there and tossing them everywhere is now like a mirror. Instant. Don't you think? There was a great calm. From violent tempest to mirror flat. Instantly. And what was the disciples' reaction? Matthew's account says, and the wording is, they were afraid before, now they're terrified. They were more afraid of Jesus and what he just did than they were of the storm in the first place. Why would they be afraid of Jesus now? You can't be in the presence of God. This is over nature. They know they're in the presence of God. They know they're in the presence of something that is absolute and supernatural. And they ask, in Matthew's account, who is this? Who is he? Even the winds and the sea obey him. They ask that in Mark's account as well.
Sort of have to test on a little bit. But every miracle that he had performed, not only were like individual, but it was within a confine of a small area, a certain circumstance.
Mm-hmm.
So this was, in their sense, wide. It was the universe as far as they were concerned.
Right. Now, he's done some pretty impressive things to this point. Very impressive. He's done some powerful, powerful things. Miracles that cannot be explained and were absolutely and obviously miracles. But this went beyond humanity, and this was the world to them. He is in complete control. They are awestruck. They are terrified. Not so much at him, but at his power. And notice their wording. Even the wind and the sea obeys him. In other words, I think in their mind, there's nothing he can't do. He can do it all. So that's the first windstorm. The second windstorm, recorded in the Gospels, takes place the evening after the Lord feeds 5,000 men plus women and children. It's right before Passover. I'm going to say AD 29. Let's go over to John chapter 6. Beginning with verse 1. After this, Jesus went away to the other side, another political district of the Sea of Galilee, which is the Sea of Tiberias, and a large crowd was following because they saw the signs that he was doing on the sick. Jesus went up on the mountain, and there he sat down with his disciples. Now, the Passover, the feast of the Jews, was at hand. Okay, it gives us time of year. And he goes on and continuing to read the story, lifting up his eyes then, and seeing that a large crowd was coming toward him, Jesus says to Philip, "Where are we to buy bread so that these people may eat?" He said this to test him, for he himself knew what he would do. Philip answered, 200 denarii would not buy enough bread for each of them to get a loaf. One of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said to him, "There is a boy here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish, but what are they for so many?" Jesus said, "Have the people sit down." Now there was much grass in the place, so the men sat down, about 5,000 in number. Jesus then took the loaves, and when he had given thanks, he distributed them to those who were seated, so also the fish, as much as they wanted. And when they had eaten their fill, he told his disciples, "Gather up the leftover fragments, that nothing may be lost." So they gathered them up and filled 12 baskets with fragments from the 5 barley loaves left by those who had eaten. When the people saw the sign that he had done, they said, "This is indeed the prophet who has come into the world." Perceiving then that they were about to come and take him by force to make him king, Jesus withdrew again to the mountain by himself. Now, we understand that's a great story, but let's focus on our story for tonight, which now starts at verse 16. When evening came, his disciples went down to the sea, got into a boat, and started across the sea to Capernaum. It's now dark. Jesus has not yet come to them. The sea became rough because of what? A strong wind blowing. When they had rowed about 3 or 4 miles, sometimes we forget they didn't have a Mercruiser or an Evinrude. These are not lightweight boats either. These are heavy boats. Now they may have had sails to help them, but They rowed about 3 or 4 miles. They saw Jesus walking on the sea and coming near the boat. And they were frightened. But he said to them, "It is I. Do not be afraid." And they were glad to take him into the boat, and immediately the boat was at the land to which they were going. Wow. So many things we don't often pick up on. We don't often read John's account because Matthew has an addition. What is it?
Peter walked.
Yeah. It's so, we focus so much on Peter walking on the water, we don't often read John's account. But Matthew records Peter wanting to get out of the boat and walk to the water to Jesus. And the Lord invites him to come. So Peter gets out of the boat, walks on the water for how long?
Not far.
Yeah, we don't know. Not far, but as long as he had his eyes on Jesus, he walked on the water. And when he took his eyes off of Jesus and he focused on the storm, he began to sink. And he prayed the shortest prayer in the Bible, which is, "Lord, save me." Matthew 14:30. But again, the facts to notice concerning the type of storm that the disciples are engaged in and that Jesus calms, well, let's look again at John's account. Evening comes, the disciples go down to the sea, they get in a boat, they start across the sea to Capernaum. Where's Capernaum? Right here. Which direction do you think they're traveling? West? Northwest? They get into a boat, start across to Capernaum. I'm looking back in John to see if we have a starting point. I don't see it immediately. But it's dark, so this is evening. Jesus is not in the boat. The sea becomes rough because of a strong wind. They've rowed 3 or 4 miles out. They see a ghost, a figure. They don't know who it is until Jesus identifies himself. They're afraid. Again, these are men's men, and they're afraid when they see somebody out there or something out there. But he says, "It's I, do not be afraid." Then they were glad to take him into the boat. Why do you suppose they're glad to take him into the boat? Well, he's done this before. The first story we've already read about. Surely they're going to remember that. And they're thinking, okay, he's going to tell the wind to stop. And it's going to become calm. That's not what he does, however. What does he do? He invites Peter to come out onto the boat and walk with him. Or at least Peter asks if he can. But in John's account, note this, verse 21, they're glad to take him into the boat, and what happens? Immediately, it's at the land. Does that mean they broke time-space continuum and went from the 3 or 4 miles out to land?
The winds may just carry them there.
The winds may have carried them in, the storm, the current, something, but as soon as they invite him into the boat, immediately, he says, it's at the land. Don't we read about something like that with Philip? and the eunuch. There's kind of this break in the time-space continuum. Don't we read that with Jesus appearing in a room? Josephus, the first century historian, describes a winter windstorm that occurred during the siege of Gamla, located in the Golan Heights in AD 67, which is just it's a few years later, but he is describing there's a war going on, that the Jews have started an uprising against the Romans. And in the middle of the battle, this winter windstorm comes in. This is what he writes. Here the Jews worked havoc among the advancing enemy with arrows and rocks as they rolled them down on them, being themselves from their elevated position no easy mark for an arrow. However, to seal their ruin, a storm miraculously arose, which, blowing full in their faces, and he notes it's from the east, carried against them the arrows of the Romans and checked and deflected their own. Owing to the force of the gale, they could neither stand on the edge of the precipice, having no firm foothold, nor see the approaching enemy. So they were at war, shooting arrows at each other, but the one had the upper hand, and then this gale force wind comes along, and they basically had to stop because they couldn't see, couldn't stand up. And the winds were so strong they couldn't even shoot the arrows. I think the point is, in these cases with the stories, and in Josephus' case, we picture night, thunder and lightning, rain. It's not the same kind of storm. It's just gale force winds that suddenly pick up, and they are strong. Mendel Nunn has a book called The Sea of Galilee and Its Fishermen in the New Testament. This is what he says. A red sunset indicates a stable atmosphere. I've heard that. Red sky at night. Sailor's delight. Red sky in the morning. Sailor take warning. But watch. A red sunset indicates a stable atmosphere because there are no upward air currents. Dust in the atmosphere remains close to the earth, and these particles refract rays of light into red. So you see red, there are no up currents. You know this storm isn't going to just appear. He said, but this is also true for the morning forecast. Okay, that's where my little saying got it wrong. At least in this particular geographical area, it's true for the morning forecast. The atmosphere is stable, but the appearance of low clouds would signify a possible change from fair weather to stormy. So he says, watch for the low clouds. If it's red, if you have a red sky in the morning or evening, you're okay. But when these low clouds develop, that's when the storms are going to develop. That's from a lifelong fisherman on the Sea of Galilee. Let's go one more place. Go to Luke chapter 12. Luke 12:54. Jesus is giving a weather forecast. He's in Jericho. He says to the crowds, when you see a cloud rising, where? In the west, you say at once, a shower is coming. What's to the west? Mediterranean. He's talking about anytime They could see those rain showers, the traditional storm, if you will, that's just rain and thunder and lightning showers and all of that. They come out of the west. They also come out of the north, because the Mediterranean goes up that way as well. But when they come out of the east, it's typically these winds, the gale force winds. The psalmist in Psalm 29 describes the direction of a mighty storm as going from the Lebanon mountain range, that's Mount Hermon, all the way down to Kadesh Barnea. That's describing north to south storms. Proverbs 25, verse 23 states, the north wind brings forth rain, and a backbiting tongue, and angry countenance. Storms come from the west and the north. But when they come from the east, it's more like we think of as I had the word, now I can't think of it. What do you call those straight line winds? Straight line wind. What did we just have in Iowa?
Geographical.
Say it again.
Geographical. Derecho.
That. Derecho, or some have been saying Derecho or something.
Derecho.
Yeah, all kinds of pronunciations. That is more like what we have here, I think. These straight line winds, which if you're in a sailing vessel, that's not good, is it? Your thoughts. Time is just about up. What are your thoughts? You don't like the water anyway.
Well, that miracle, they go and get it on ship, walking on the water and people. That not only affected those in the boat, but it affected the ones in the other time, because they had noticed that it was just the disciples that got on the boat. And then here's Jesus, where have you got us?
Yeah.
So they were questioning.
Possibly, yeah.
It was a lesson for them.
Yeah.
And I can understand the fear to a certain extent, because I was on a small lake one time. My son, who was about 15, in a little john boat, we were bass fishing, and just out of nowhere, we hadn't looked at the radar or anything beforehand. There was just a big storm. I mean, huge winds and lightning and thunder, and that was just.
It's scary.
I was praying as hard as I could pray, and we had no control over it. We had paddles. It blew us into the shore, but I can tell you, I can't imagine. I can imagine a little bit just from that, and how scared I was in that little boat. Man, they were with Jesus, and they were still afraid. So.
That's right. Next week, we're going to leave the Sea of Galilee. We're going to go to Gentile territory, and Jesus trips there. He didn't just minister in Israel. He went to some Gentile territories, and we're going to look at that next week. Thank you for coming out tonight. Let's have a word of prayer. We'll be dismissed. Father, thank you for your love for us. Thank you for a Savior in the time of storms. Sometimes we ask silly questions like, don't you care? But Father, remind us that there's no one who cares more than you. Thank you for being there for us. Help us to see. Help us to open our eyes and see that you are there indeed. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.